Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Eldritch Archives. Today we are continuing our investigation of the origins of folk horror. Last episode, we looked at a brief history of paganism and why pagans became a source of fear for the Christian world. We explored and investigated why ancient and lost traditions seem sinister and eerie, and why British landscapes and Neolithic ruins came to inspire folk horror. And then we finished by looking at how pagan festivals and traditions were incorporated into Christianity. Today we are going to continue by looking at a book which is supposedly a real religious text from a secret witch cult in rural Italy. And we will continue investigating the legacy of pagan religions and their role in folk horror. Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches. One intriguing account of a possible pagan survival comes from 1899, when folklorist Charles Leland published Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches. This book was supposedly the genuine doctrine of a witch cult that existed in rural Italy. In the 1890s, Leland was researching and publishing books on Italian folklore. During this time, he met an Italian woman who went by the name Maddalena. Over the next several years, Leland learned about Italian folklore from Maddalena, which informed several of his books about the remnants of Roman traditions in Tuscany and the folklore of Florence. In the appendix of Aradia, Leland describes how he came to be in possession of this witch's gospel. I learned that there was in existence a manuscript setting forth the doctrines of Italian witchcraft, and I was promised that, if possible, it should be obtained for me. In this, I was for a time disappointed, but having urged it on Maddalena, my collector of folklore, while she was leading a wandering life in Tuscany, to make the effort to obtain or recover something of the kind, I at last received it from her on January the 1st, 1897, entitled Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches. Eventually, in 1899, despite the hesitancy of the publisher, Leland managed to publish the text. The book contains legends of Diana, a Roman goddess, written in prose poetry, and various incantations and instructions such as how to conduct a witch's sabbath. In the appendix of the book, Leland also writes, "Witches even yet form a fragmentary secret society or sect. They call it that of the old religion, and there are, in the Romagna, entire villages in which the people are completely heathen." Aradia is available to read on Wikisource, and it's really quite interesting and worth the time at least to flick through. The veracity of Aradia has been questioned ever since its publication, however. The manuscript of the book, which Leland received from Maddalena, was handwritten in her own writing, indicating that she either copied it from another text or that it was dictated to her, or that either she or Leland plagiarized it. The text itself is quite controversial. Of course, there are accusations of plagiarism or a hoax, but the text also inspired, or informed, depending on your point of view, the Wicca religion. The debate of Aradia's authenticity goes on, and this video isn't going to determine the truth of the matter once and for all. You'll have to make up your own mind on that.
Witchcraft is not nonsense, Barlow.
I'm sorry, Driscoll. Witchcraft, black magic, sorcery, to me it's nothing but fairy tale mumbo-jumbo.
If Leland's hypothesis is correct, then this is evidence of a secret pagan cult hiding in rural areas of Italy as late as the 1890s. When it comes to the survivals of pagan religions, the case of the idol of Triglav, which was hidden in the tree, and the witch cult, as described in Aradia, are the exception. Mainly, it seems that where aspects of pagan religion did survive, they were incorporated into Christian beliefs. This is reflected in some folk horror stories, when a pagan cult exists alongside Christianity, or is even supported by Christianity. In the novel Harvest Home, the devout Christians of the village are also pagan worshippers in secret, and to the villagers, these beliefs do not seem to contradict each other. This is also the case in Robin Redbreast, where the main character is even urged by the villagers to go to church. In fact, the Slavic native faith, such as that of the Kievan Rus culture, is a good example of how a religion can be incorporated into Christianity. Kupala Day, or Ivan Kupala Day, is an Eastern European festival, roughly taking place on the summer solstice. Kupala originally was a major festival of the Slavic native faith, but after the advent of Christianity, the festival also came to celebrate the nativity of John the Baptist. Kupala was a Slavic god, and also possibly associated with water. John the Baptist replaced Kupala since he was also associated with water, and the date of his birth was close to the date of Kupala Day. The two festivals were conveniently merged. The festival's original name, Kupala, was merged with the name of John the Baptist, John, or rather the Slavic version of the name, Ivan, and this was used to create Ivan Kupala Day. As described in the book Polish Customs, Traditions and Folklore by Sophie Horodowicz-Knab, the Polish custom celebrating St. John's Eve can be traced back to before the spread of Christianity. The custom was lost throughout the western part of Poland, and where it wasn't entirely eradicated, a Christianized version took its place. Ivan Kupala Day, despite taking on Christian overtones, still contained many pagan ceremonies and traditions. Girls traditionally weave wreaths, which are then set adrift on the river, which was once, perhaps, meant to win the favor of water spirits. Bonfires are also burnt on Ivan Kupala Eve. People would often also jump over these bonfires as a form of purification ritual. There is also a traditional dance formed. People hold hands and dance around the bonfires in a circle, accompanied by communal singing. These traditions predate Christianity, but have survived despite the merging of the festival into a Christian holiday. In Harvest Home, we see a very similar tradition taking place. The onlookers joined hands and began circling the blaze in a clockwise direction, forming a great urgent chain. Scornfully, I watched. It was like a grotesque sports rally, and as they passed, link after link in their human chain, I hated them. These hayseeds and their stupid dance, their stupid singing, their stupid beliefs, the old ways. In The Wicker Man, some of these practices are also shown. Interestingly enough, an English translation of this day's name is St. John's Day, and in 1830, the famous Ukrainian author Nikolai Gogol actually wrote a story about this holiday called St. John's Eve, which many people hold up as a very early folk horror story. In fact, Nikolai Gogol wrote quite a few scary stories based on folklore. Another example is The V, which was made into a film in 1967, and this film, I think, really does count as one of the very first folk horror films. The V is definitely worth a watch. So, here we have a good case for pagan rituals, which were incorporated into Christian holidays, which then went on to inspire horror stories. We have Kupala, which then turned into St. John's Day, which was then used as a plot device by a writer for a horror story. While Nikolai Gogol's stories don't fit our modern definition of folk horror, the stories are meant to be scary, and they are about folklore. So there is a strong case that Nikolai Gogol's stories are some of the first examples of folk horror. On my previous video, a comment by the sci-fi cultist brought up an interesting idea, that the underground, or secret religion, which is part of the inspiration of folk horror, actually has its roots in the suppression of Catholicism after the English Reformation of the Church by Protestants who sought to expel Catholicism from the Church in England. The Roman Catholic Church basically was outlawed for several hundred years in England during this time, but there was apparently a large amount of people who still practiced Catholicism in secret. I don't find this to be as strong a connection as paganism, but it's certainly possible that this was also an inspiration for the secret cult trope in folk horror. To be honest, debating the history of religion and its suppression is far beyond the scope of this video and of my expertise, so feel free to correct me in the comments. I'd be especially interested in any other examples of pagan survivals which existed. The examples I have discussed prove that older religious rituals can and have been repurposed to serve newer beliefs. And you could say that where there is smoke, there is fire. If these pagan traditions were incorporated into Christian festivals, then what other traditions survived under the surface or on the borders of society? Witch cults and witch trials. As I've mentioned before, The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray was one of the first books to popularize the idea of pagan cults in hiding. This was certainly not the first time this idea was present in books or in society. In many ways, the witch cult in Western Europe was almost like a reintroduction of this idea into popular thought. One of the earliest examples of folk horror is a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne from 1835 called Young Goodman Brown. In the story, a young man discovers, to his horror, that all the people in the town he lives in are secretly members of a devil-worshipping cult. This story, while being a kind of religious allegorical tale, could also definitely be described as a folk horror story as well. But where did the idea for Young Goodman Brown come from? Well, Nathaniel Hawthorne's inspiration for the idea of a secret devil-worshipping cult is really quite personal and relates to his own family history. If you know the history of the Salem witch trials, you might recognize the name Hawthorne, because Nathaniel Hawthorne is the great-great-grandson of John Haythorne, one of the judges who presided over the witch trials at Salem. John Haythorne was the only judge who took part in the witch trials who never expressed regret or repented for his actions during the trials. That fact is hugely important to understanding Nathaniel Hawthorne and his writing. His family even changed the spelling of their last name to be less associated with the grim and embarrassing history of the witch trials. The name Haythorne became Hawthorne. The witch trials at Salem began due to accusations of a secret cult involving members of the village of Salem. So here we can see the probable inspiration for the story Young Goodman Brown. While the Salem witch trials are an important part of history and an important inspiration for American folk horror, as far as witch trials went, the Salem trials were actually at the end of this period, which had ravaged Europe from the 15th to the 18th century. In fact, if you read the history of the Salem trials, it seems that there was an initial wave of hysteria, but after the damage had been done and everything settled down again, everyone seems to have been quite embarrassed about the whole affair. Several people expressed their regret at their own accusations during the trial. The idea of witches and witch trials were almost becoming a bit old-fashioned by this point in history. The whole town of Salem seems to have been a bit embarrassed that they had been so incensed by the idea to begin with. It made them look a bit unsophisticated and rural to society at large. 19 people were ultimately killed due to the trials at Salem, but throughout the witch trials in Europe, there was approximately 35,000 executions. The fact that such events could occur shows how strongly the population at the time believed in witchcraft and magic. This is why I say that Margaret Murray's book is really just a reintroduction of these ideas into society. People had long believed that witch cults existed, but Murray approached this theory from an anthropological perspective, which lent this theory some level of credibility. Margaret Murray's main hypothesis was that witchcraft and witches were actually the survival of a more ancient religion. Evidence to support Murray's theory is really quite slim, but I think that the belief in witches by medieval society probably is related to the remnants of paganism, even if it's only tangentially. Now, this point requires a bit of clarification. Murray is arguing that there was a genuine organized society of witches with a defined religion. This idea has been quite thoroughly discredited. It does seem that the concept of a witch and the devil, as conceived of during the medieval period, does seem to be created from the remnants of pagan religion. During the medieval period, gods from other religions did become associated and incorporated with the Christian conception of the devil. Most notably, Pan, the Greek god of the wild, who is depicted as a man with the legs and horns of a goat, became associated with the Christian devil. This image of the devil still persists to this day. This association, according to some theories, was a conscious effort by Christian leaders to demonize paganism and previous religions. So, there is a connection between witches and pagans. Witches were, of course, people who worshiped the devil, and by associating pagan gods with the devil, it meant that anybody who worshipped those gods would be considered a witch. Okay, so this is really just speculation on my part. But if we wanted to push it a bit further, we could say that the fear of witches who were in league with the devil is also a fear of pagans who maybe still worshipped their old gods. All of this is still happening in medieval history, though. Folk horror takes these ideas and moves them from the past into the present day. So where does this idea of pagan cults in the modern day come from? We can find an important clue to this by looking at one of the very first folk horror films, Robin Redbreast. I've already said that I think that this film really deserves to be recognized as one of the first folk horror films. If you look into the history of the film, the writer, John Griffith Bowen, describes a very interesting influence he had when he was writing the film.
If you like, the inception of it was a murder at the village of Lower Quinton, in which a tramp was murdered by, I think, villagers, and his body dragged along so that the blood could fertilize the crops.
The murder of Charles Walton. The murder which John Griffith Bowen is talking about is the murder of a man named Charles Walton on the 14th of February 1945. This case has actually played a very important role in creating folk horror, not just because it inspired Bowen to write Robin Redbreast. This murder was a sensation in the media and tabloids when it happened, and the erroneous details which were circulated actually laid the groundwork for the idea of a secret pagan cult in a small village. This is the story. On the 14th of February 1945, a man named Charles Walton was working on a farm, pruning hedges in Lower Quinton, England. Sometime during the morning, Walton was brutally murdered. Walton, being 75 years old at the time, walked with the aid of a walking stick. Walton was beaten around the head with that walking stick before having his throat cut with a billhook and being impaled with a pitchfork through his throat. No one was ever charged with the murder of Charles Walton, and the case is unsolved to this day. Several aspects of this case made it very interesting to the public. First, the murder was speculated to be ritualistic in nature. According to some local folklore from that region of England, one way to kill a witch and undo their magic was to impale them on a pitchfork. There was speculation that because Walton was impaled by a pitchfork, perhaps somebody locally thought that he was a witch and had killed him for this reason. Another rumor was that Walton had been murdered by a cult of druids because the site of the murder was relatively close to a stone circle. Both of these rumors were dubious to say the least. Firstly, impaling a suspected witch on a pitchfork was actually never really a practice, and the murder did not take place near a stone circle. The nearest stone circle was about 12 miles away, and it's not really a stone circle, more of a stone clump. Apart from these suppositions, it was also rumored that the police detectives investigating the crime met with a surly response from the villagers of Lower Quinton. For this reason, some sources speculated that the villagers knew very well what had happened, but were choosing not to tell the police what they knew. So, when we consider this case, we can see that there are several elements of the classic folk horror narrative present. Firstly, a murder in a rural area. Secondly, the presence of a possible ritual or occult motivation for the murder. Thirdly, an insular community which has a secret or is hostile to outsiders. When John Griffith Bowen talks about this murder in the interview that I played, he describes the case incorrectly. He says the villagers dragged the body through the fields in order to fertilize the soil. The fact that John Griffith Bowen not only gets the details of the case wrong, but actually includes details that never really existed, tells us something very important. This case seeped into the public's imagination and took on a life of its own. According to John Griffith Bowen, when Robin Redbreast was aired in 1970, people immediately knew what had inspired the film.
And the man from the Birmingham Post said clearly based on the murder in Lower Quinton, which indeed it was.
It shows that this case was well known to the general public, and there was a general consensus, albeit a wrong consensus, that the murder was ritual in nature. This should really be no surprise. The murder of Charles Walton was salacious, a gruesome murder, an unsolved mystery, a village conspiracy, and ancient rituals. Who wouldn't want to read about that? It's clear that by the time John Griffith Bowen wrote Robin Redbreast, the case had become an urban legend, a campfire tale that most people knew of even though the facts were exaggerated. It's no wonder that when a film like Robin Redbreast or The Wicker Man came along, the public ate it up. It was a story that was already popular. If you're interested in hearing more about the murder of Charles Walton, I really suggest you check out a podcast called Hypnogoria. There is a 3-episode series all about these murders, which thoroughly goes through the history of the case and how it impacted Britain. I was actually pretty chuffed when I listened to the shows because the podcaster, Jim Moon, comes to the same conclusion which I did in my first video about folk horror. That is that the book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, is the conception of the folk horror genre in the modern media. Although Jim Moon comes to that conclusion via a different route than I did. Anyway, I highly suggest that you check out the podcast. I'm going to link it below in the description. This is a good point to end the episode, but since I brought up the witch cult in Western Europe again, it's a good time to say that there is another anthropological text which heavily inspired folk horror, and was the conception of the idea that human sacrifices were once practiced to bring fertility to the land. In the next episode, we will thoroughly explore this text and how the anthropology and history described in the book was directly lifted for many of the first folk horror films and stories, including The Wicker Man, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support the channel, please consider buying one of the folk horror audiobooks on my Bandcamp page, such as Randall's Round by Eleanor Scott or The Temple of Death by A.C. Benson. I'll link the page below. All these audiobooks are available for free on my YouTube channel, but if you would like the MP3s of the audiobooks, you can buy them and pay whatever you want, whether that be $1 or $10. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.